The moment my son looked me in the eye and said, "You live here because of me," something inside me didn't break. It went still. This was the house my husband and I built from nothing, every wall, every payment, every memory, and yet there he stood in my kitchen speaking to me like I was a guest. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply turned, walked down the hallway, unlocked a drawer, and pulled out the one file he had spent years hoping I would never open. If this moment shocked you, I'd really appreciate you taking a second to like and subscribe. It helps me share stories like this with others who need them. And tell me, what would you have done in my place? I'd love to hear your thoughts, and also where you're watching from today. My name is Elaine Barrett, and at 68 years old, I never imagined I would have to question whether my own home still belonged to me. I've lived in Columbus, Ohio for most of my adult life. My late husband, Robert, everyone called him Bob, built a small construction business from the ground up. He wasn't a flashy man, but he was steady, reliable, the kind of man who fixed things quietly and paid his bills on time. That house, the one I was standing in when my son spoke those words, wasn't just a place we lived. It was the result of decades of sacrifice, late nights, tight budgets, careful planning. When Bob passed away 2 years ago, everything changed. Grief doesn't arrive like a storm. Not for me, at least. It settled in slowly like dust. At first, it was the silence. No footsteps in the morning. No coffee already brewing. No quiet voice reminding me where he left his glasses. Then came the decisions, the ones he used to handle without even thinking. Insurance, taxes, repairs. I had always been organized, but suddenly everything felt heavier, like I was carrying 2 lives instead of 1. That's when my son Michael stepped in. At first I was grateful. He started coming by more often, saying he wanted to help me stay on top of things. He offered to handle the bills, said it would take stress off my shoulders. He'd sit at the kitchen table with a stack of envelopes, flipping through them quickly, telling me what mattered and what didn't. "Mom, you don't need to worry about this stuff anymore," he'd say, smiling like he was doing me a favor. And I believed him. After all, he was my son, my only child. The boy I raised, the one I stayed up with when he had fevers, the one I worked overtime to send to a good school. Trusting him didn't feel like a risk. It felt natural. His wife, Tiffany, started coming with him more often, too. Tiffany always looked put together, perfect hair, perfect clothes, perfect smile. But there was something about the way she spoke to me that never quite sat right. She was polite always, careful with her words, but underneath that politeness was something colder, controlled. "We just want what's best for you, Elaine," she would say, her tone gentle but firm, like she had already decided what best meant. At first it was small things. Michael suggested I cancel a few subscriptions I barely used. That made sense. Then he recommended I sell an old car that had been sitting in the garage since Bob passed. I hesitated, but he insisted it was just wasting value. Eventually I agreed. Looking back, that was the first time something felt off. Not wrong enough to question, just enough to make me pause. Then came the mail. At first I didn't notice anything unusual. Michael would arrive before I had a chance to bring it in from the mailbox. He'd gather everything, sort it neatly, and place a smaller pile on the table for me. "Just junk and bills, Mom. I've taken care of the important stuff," he'd say. Again, I trusted him. But over time, I started to realize I wasn't seeing everything anymore. There were moments, small, fleeting ones, when I would think, "Didn't I receive a statement from the bank last month?" Or, "Wasn't there a letter about property taxes I meant to reread?" But every time I asked, Michael had an answer ready. "It's handled. You already signed that. Don't worry about it." And so I tried not to. Grief has a way of making you want things to be easy, to accept help without questioning it too deeply. I told myself I was lucky to have a son who cared enough to step in, but care shouldn't feel like being slowly pushed to the side. Tiffany's role in all of this became clearer over time. She never touched the paperwork directly, at least not in front of me, but she guided everything. She would sit on the couch while Michael worked at the table, occasionally chiming in with suggestions. Maybe we should simplify things for her, she'd say, or long-term this house might be too much responsibility. It was always framed as concern, always wrapped in kindness. But there was an assumption in her voice that I couldn't ignore, an assumption that I wouldn't be the one making decisions much longer. I remember one afternoon very clearly. Michael had just finished going through a stack of envelopes, and Tiffany was standing by the window looking out at the yard. "You know," she said casually, "this place could actually be worth a lot more if it was updated properly." Michael nodded. "Yeah, but that would take time." Still, she continued, "It's something to think about. Long term." I was sitting right there. Not once did either of them ask what I thought. That was the moment a quiet discomfort settled into something heavier. Not fear. Not yet. But awareness. I began to notice how often decisions were being made around me instead of with me. How conversations would pause when I entered the room. How Michael would answer questions that weren't directed at him. And yet every time I considered saying something, I stopped myself. Because what if I was wrong? What if I was just lonely? It's a dangerous thing doubting your own instincts, especially when the people you're questioning are the ones you love most. The truth is, I didn't want to believe there was anything wrong. Accepting that possibility would mean accepting something much harder, that my own son might not have my best interests at heart. So I stayed quiet. I let Michael handle the bills. I let Tiffany suggest changes. I let myself believe that this was what family looked like after loss, messy, imperfect, but ultimately well-meaning. But deep down, something kept whispering to me. Something wasn't right. And I think, if I'm being honest, I knew it long before I was ready to admit it. I just didn't realize how far things had already gone. There's a moment when a place you've lived in for decades stops feeling like your home and becomes something else entirely. For me, that moment didn't come all at once. It crept in quietly, almost politely, until one day I realized I no longer recognized the rhythm of my own house. It started with small changes. Michael began stopping by even when I hadn't asked him to. At first, I told myself it was thoughtful, a son checking in on his mother. But then I noticed he wasn't just visiting, he was managing. One morning, I came downstairs to find a man in my kitchen measuring the countertops. I stood there for a second, confused, still holding my coffee mug. "Excuse me," I said. Michael turned from the doorway like nothing was unusual. "Oh, hey, Mom, this is Rick. He's just taking a look at the cabinets." I blinked. For what Michael gave a small shrug. "Just seeing what updates might look like. This place could use a refresh." A refresh. He said it so casually, like he was talking about repainting a bedroom, not changing a house that wasn't his. "I didn't ask for that," I said carefully. Tiffany, who was leaning against the wall scrolling through her phone, looked up just long enough to smile. "We're just exploring options, Elaine. No decisions have been made, but that wasn't the point. They were making plans. In my house. Without me." After that, the changes came faster. Michael replaced the spare key system I'd used for years. He said it was for security reasons, that the old locks were outdated. He handed me a new key on a small silver ring, but something about it felt symbolic, like I was being issued access to a place I used to own. Then there were the contractors. They came and went at irregular hours. Sometimes Michael would be there with them, other times he'd leave them to finish up while I stayed in the living room, unsure whether I was supposed to supervise or stay out of the way. Once I overheard one of them ask, "So are you the homeowner?" And before I could even open my mouth, Michael answered, "Yeah, basically." Basically. That word sat in my chest long after the man left. Tiffany's behavior shifted too, though hers was harder to pinpoint. She never raised her voice, never said anything outright disrespectful. But the way she spoke to me, it was as if she had already placed me in a category I hadn't agreed to. "You shouldn't worry about things like this," she'd say when I asked questions, or "We're just trying to make your life easier." It always sounded reasonable. That was the problem. Because every time I felt uncomfortable, I had to ask myself, am I being difficult? But discomfort doesn't come from nowhere. It builds. It gathers. And eventually, it starts to speak. The only person who seemed to notice any of this was Lily. My granddaughter had always been observant quiet in a way that made you think she was distracted, but really she was paying attention to everything. She'd started spending more time with me after school, sitting at the kitchen table while I made tea or pretending to scroll on her phone while watching the adults move around the house. One afternoon, she caught me staring at the new lock on the back door. "You don't like it, do you?" she asked softly. I turned to her, surprised. "It's not that I said. It's just different." Lily nodded like she understood more than she said. "Dad didn't even ask you, did he?" I hesitated. Then I shook my head. She looked down at her hands. "He's been doing that a lot lately." Something tightened in my chest. "What do you mean?" I asked. Lily shrugged, but it wasn't a careless gesture. It was careful, measured. Just talking about stuff. Plans. Like things are already decided. "What kind of plans?" She glanced toward the hallway as if making sure no one else was nearby. Then she lowered her voice. "I heard him on the phone the other night," she said. "He said something about once the title situation is settled." The words landed harder than I expected. "Title," I repeated. Lily nodded. "Yeah. I didn't really understand it, but..." He sounded serious. I forced a small smile, trying not to let my reaction show too clearly. "I'm sure it's nothing, sweetheart." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. Because suddenly, a dozen small moments started lining up in my mind. The missing mail. The paperwork I had signed without fully reading because Michael had said it was routine. The way he had started answering questions that weren't directed at him, the way Tiffany talked about the house like it was a project instead of a home. And now this, the title situation. That wasn't casual conversation. That was legal. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house. Every creak, every shift of the air felt different, like the walls themselves were holding something back. I thought about Bob, about how careful he had always been with everything related to the house. The way he kept records, labeled folders, double-checked documents. He used to joke that paperwork was the only thing that doesn't forget what's true. At the time I had laughed. Now I wished I had paid more attention. The next morning, I went to the kitchen earlier than usual. The mailbox hadn't been checked yet. For the first time in months, I walked out and opened it myself. Inside were a few envelopes, nothing unusual at first glance. A utility bill, a grocery store flyer, and then one letter that made me pause. It was from the bank. I turned it over in my hands, feeling a strange sense of hesitation. Why hadn't I seen this one before I opened it slowly? The contents were brief, formal, and confusing. It referenced account activity I didn't fully recognize. Nothing alarming on its own, but enough to make me question whether I had been seeing everything I was supposed to see. I stood there for a long moment, the paper trembling slightly in my hand. Then I did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I didn't wait for Michael. I didn't ask him to explain. I folded the letter, set it on the table, and made a decision. If there was something happening with my home, something legal, something hidden, I was going to find out for myself. Not as someone's mother, not as someone who needed help, but as the person whose name was supposed to be on everything that mattered. And for the first time since Bob passed, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not grief, something sharper. Awareness. The next morning, I got dressed with a kind of quiet purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. I chose a simple navy blouse, the one Bob used to say made me look steady. I didn't know exactly what I was going to find, but I knew one thing clearly: I wasn't going to ask Michael for answers anymore. If something had been done in my name, I would find it myself. The Franklin County Recorder's Office sat in a plain government building downtown. I hadn't been there in years, not since Bob handled most of those matters. Walking through those glass doors alone felt unfamiliar, like stepping into a world I had quietly handed over to someone else. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and old carpet. People stood in line holding folders waiting their turn. No one looked at me twice. That was the strange comfort of places like this. You could walk in carrying your entire life in a folder, and to everyone else, you were just another person with paperwork. I took a number and waited. When my turn came, I stepped up to the counter where a middle-aged woman with kind eyes greeted me. "How can I help you today?" she asked. I hesitated for just a moment, then steadied myself. "I'd like to check on the records for my property," I said. "I just want to make sure everything is up to date." She nodded without hesitation. "Of course." "Do you have the address?" I gave it to her. She typed quickly, her fingers moving with the ease of someone who had done this thousands of times. For a few seconds, the only sound between us was the quiet clicking of keys. Then she paused. It was subtle, but I noticed it. "Okay," she said slowly, scanning the screen. "There have been a few filings related to this property within the past year." My heart gave a small, sharp beat. "Filings," I repeated. "Yes," she said. "Nothing unusual on the surface, but there have been documents processed. Can I see them?" She nodded again, then printed out a set of records and slid them toward me. I looked down at the pages. At first it was just words, legal language, dates, reference numbers. But then certain things began to stand out: my name, the property address, and documents that I didn't fully remember signing. I felt my throat tighten. "These were filed recently?" I asked. She checked the dates. "Within the last several months, yes." I traced one line with my finger. "And this was authorized by me." She gave a careful, professional answer. "According to the records, yes. It would have required your signature or a valid authorization." "My signature." I stared at the paper longer than I should have. Because I had signed documents. Of course I had. Michael had brought them to me over the past year, papers he said were routine, necessary, nothing to worry about. "Just sign here, Mom. It's standard. I've already reviewed it." I had trusted him. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep my voice steady. "Is there anything here that transfers ownership?" The woman shook her head. "No, not directly, but some of these filings could relate to future actions depending on the context." Future actions. That phrase echoed in my mind. So nothing has changed. Yet I asked. "Not that I can see from these documents alone," she said, "but I would recommend reviewing everything carefully. If you're unsure about any of it, you might want to speak with a legal professional." I nodded, even though my thoughts were already racing. I gathered the papers and thanked her, my hands moving automatically while my mind struggled to catch up. Outside, the sunlight felt too bright. I sat in my car for several minutes without starting the engine. The documents spread across my lap. The words blurred together, but the feeling underneath them was clear. Something had been set in motion. Not completed, not finalized, but started. And I hadn't fully understood what I was agreeing to. For the first time, a cold, undeniable truth settled in my chest. Michael hadn't just been helping me. He had been guiding me carefully, deliberately through steps I didn't fully see. I drove home in silence. Every familiar street looked slightly different, as if I were seeing it from a new angle. The house, when I pulled into the driveway, felt quieter than usual. Not peaceful, just still. Michael's car wasn't there. Neither was Tiffany's. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, the soft click of the lock sounding louder than it should have. For a moment, I stood in the entryway and looked around. This was my home, but now it also felt like a place where things had happened without me. I walked slowly toward the kitchen and set the papers down on the table. My eyes drifted toward the hallway, the one that led to Bob's old study. I hadn't spent much time in that room since he passed. It had always been his space, his desk, his files, his way of organizing the world. After he was gone, I closed the door more often than I opened it. Not because I wanted to forget him, but because everything in that room reminded me of how much I had relied on him. Now, for the first time, I realized something else. Bob had never been careless. Not with business, not with money, and certainly not with something as important as our home. If there were answers anywhere, they wouldn't be in Michael's explanations. They would be in that room. I walked down the hallway slowly, my steps measured. When I reached the study door, I paused. For a second, I hesitated, not out of fear, but out of something deeper. Respect. Memory. The quiet weight of everything that room represented. Then I turned the handle and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of old paper and wood polish. The desk was exactly as Bob had left it. The shelves still lined with binders, each labeled in his neat handwriting. For a moment, grief washed over me again. But this time, it didn't weaken me. It steadied me. Because suddenly I understood something I hadn't before. Bob hadn't just left me a house. He had left me a system. A record of truth, a way to protect what we built. I walked over to the desk and ran my fingers along the edge, remembering the countless evenings he had spent there reviewing documents, double-checking numbers, making sure everything was in order. I wish I had paid more attention, I whispered softly. But maybe it wasn't too late. I opened the top drawer. Inside were folders, carefully arranged, labeled by year and category. Property taxes, insurance, contracts, everything exactly where it should be. And then in the back corner, something caught my eye. A small metal box, locked. I stared at it for a long moment. A memory surfaced, faint but unmistakable. Bob standing in this very room holding that box. Elaine, he had said, his voice calm but serious. If anything ever feels off, anything at all, you open this. At the time I had laughed it off, told him he was being overly cautious. Now my hands felt slightly unsteady as I reached toward it. Something wasn't right, and for the first time I had proof of that. But I also had something else, a feeling I hadn't felt since before Bob passed. Control. I stood there in Bob's study staring at the small metal box like it was something alive, something waiting. For a moment I didn't touch it. Grief has a strange way of tying memories to objects. That box wasn't just metal and a lock. It was Bob's voice, his caution, his quiet way of preparing for things he never fully explained. If anything ever feels off, you open this. Back then, I thought he was being overly careful. Bob always planned for the worst-case scenario. I used to tease him about it, tell him life didn't need to be managed like a construction project. Now, standing in that room alone, I realized he hadn't been planning for life. He had been planning for people. My hands were steady when I finally reached for the box. It was heavier than I expected. I set it gently on the desk and opened the drawer beneath it, searching for anything that might help me unlock it. Bob had never been careless with keys. Everything had a place. And then I saw it. A small envelope tucked in the corner labeled in his handwriting, E. Barrett. Personal. My breath caught. I picked it up slowly, almost afraid to open it, but something inside me, the same instinct that brought me here, pushed me forward. Inside was a single key and a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it carefully. Bob's handwriting filled the page, neat, precise, unmistakably his. Elaine, if you're reading this, something doesn't feel right. Trust that instinct. Don't let anyone rush you, pressure you, or make you feel like you're confused. You're not. Everything you need is in this box. Take your time. Read it all. And remember, you don't owe anyone control just because they ask for it. Bob. My vision blurred for a second and I had to blink to steady it. He had known, or at least he had suspected something like this could happen. I set the note aside, my chest tightening with a mix of grief and something else, something stronger. Clarity. I picked up the key and inserted it into the lock. It turned easily. The soft click echoed in the quiet room. I lifted the lid. Inside were neatly organized documents folders labeled in Bob's handwriting, each one carefully arranged. No clutter, no confusion, just information. The first folder was labeled Property, Primary Residence. I opened it. Inside were copies of the original deed to the house dated years back, long before Michael had any involvement in anything related to it. My name and Bob's name were both clearly listed along with legal descriptions of the property, but that wasn't what caught my attention. Behind the deed was another document, a trust agreement. I frowned slightly and leaned closer, reading the title more carefully. The Barrett Family Residential Trust. I didn't remember signing this, but as I read, further pieces began to fall into place. The house had been placed into a trust years ago, structured in a way that protected ownership and control. It outlined conditions, restrictions, and specific language about how the property could and could not be transferred. And one thing stood out immediately. Michael had no authority over it. Not now. Not automatically in the future. Not without specific conditions being met. I sat back slowly, my heart beating a little faster. This changed everything. If the house was protected by a trust, then whatever Michael thought he was doing, whatever paperwork he had me sign, it wasn't as simple as he believed. I moved to the next folder. Financial records, family loans. Inside were records I had almost forgotten. Years of them. Michael had struggled financially more than once. I knew that, but what I hadn't fully realized was how often Bob had stepped in to help and how carefully he had documented every single instance. Loan agreements, dates, amounts, repayment terms, and next to many of them, notes. Bob's notes, missed second payment, agreed to extension, no follow-up, pattern of avoidance. My throat tightened as I read. This wasn't just a list of loans, it was a pattern, a history, one I had chosen not to look at too closely while Bob was alive, because it was easier to believe things would improve, because he was our son. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting that reality settle. Then I opened the next folder. Private notes. I hesitated. Something about that label felt different, more personal, more final. But I opened it anyway. Inside was a typed document with Bob's signature at the bottom. It wasn't long, but every word mattered. He wrote about Michael, not with anger, not with cruelty, but with concern, deep, steady concern. He described Michael's tendency to avoid responsibility, his habit of relying on others to fix problems, his ability to present himself as capable while quietly shifting burdens onto those around him. And then there was a line I couldn't stop reading. If Michael ever attempts to take control through pressure, confusion, or entitlement, Elaine must rely on documentation, not emotion. I felt something inside me shift. Not break, not shatter. Shift. Because for the first time, I wasn't just reacting to what was happening, I was understanding it. This wasn't new behavior. This wasn't a sudden change in Michael after his father's death. This was who he had been for a long time. Bob had seen it, documented it, prepared for it, and I had chosen not to see it clearly. A wave of guilt passed through me, but it didn't stay long, because guilt didn't change facts, and the facts were sitting right in front of me. I reached the final section of the box, a sealed envelope. No label this time, just my name. I opened it slowly. Inside were additional notarized documents, legal reinforcements tied to the trust, clarifications, safeguards, language that made it even harder for anyone to manipulate ownership or claim control without proper authority. And attached to it, a short handwritten note. This is the part they won't expect. I stared at those words. They. Bob hadn't written he. He had written they, as if he understood this wouldn't be just Michael, as if he knew influence could come from elsewhere, from a spouse, from pressure, from shared decisions that didn't include me. I let out a slow breath and closed the box. The room felt different now, not heavier, clearer. For the first time since Michael started helping, I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't wondering if I was overreacting. I wasn't questioning my own instincts. I had proof, not just of what had been done, but of what had been planned for. Bob hadn't left me defenseless. He had left me prepared. And suddenly Michael's words from the night before echoed in my mind again. You live here because of me. I almost smiled, not out of amusement, but out of something steadier, certainty. Because now I knew the truth, and more importantly, I had everything I needed to prove it. I didn't confront Michael right away. That was the first real decision I made after opening Bob's file, and maybe the most important one. For years, I had responded to things emotionally. If something felt wrong, I either avoided it or tried to smooth it over. But this time, something inside me was different, sharper, calmer. I understood now that reacting too quickly would only give Michael time to adjust his story, so instead I watched. I paid attention to everything, the way he spoke, the timing of his visits, the things he assumed I didn't notice. And the more I watched, the clearer his motives became. It started with the mail again. That afternoon, Michael arrived just before noon, as he often did. I was already in the kitchen, sitting quietly with a cup of tea and a folded newspaper. When he walked in, he barely acknowledged me before heading straight for the counter. "Hey, Mom," he said casually. Mail come yet. It's on the table, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. He picked it up immediately, flipping through the envelopes with practiced speed. I noticed how his fingers paused just for a fraction of a second on one particular envelope before sliding it into his pocket. Not into the pile. Into his pocket. I said nothing. But something inside me tightened. Anything important, I asked, watching him carefully. He shook his head without even looking up. Just junk and a couple bills. I'll take care of it. Of course he would. I nodded slowly, pretending to accept it. But now I knew better. That evening after he left, I went through the trash. It wasn't something I ever imagined myself doing, not in my own home, but I needed to know. There beneath a crumpled grocery bag, I found torn pieces of an envelope. I carefully pieced them together on the table, my hands steady despite the growing certainty in my chest. It was from a credit institution. Not mine. Michael's. And it mentioned something that made my stomach drop. Outstanding balance. Final notice. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the words. So that was it. Not just small financial stress. Not temporary difficulty. This was deeper, more urgent. And suddenly, everything else started to make sense. The rushed decisions, the pressure, the subtle push toward simplifying my life. It wasn't about helping me, it was about solving his problems. I didn't sleep much that night. But this time, it wasn't confusion keeping me awake. It was clarity. The next morning, I decided to take things a step further. I went through my own records, what little I still had access to, and compared them to what I had found in Bob's file. There were gaps, missing statements, accounts I hadn't actively reviewed in months. That alone was enough to concern me. But then I noticed something else. Several automatic payments had been adjusted. Not canceled. Not added. Adjusted. Small amounts subtle enough that I might not have questioned them at first glance, but consistent. Too consistent. Someone had been managing my finances more closely than I realized. And that someone wasn't me. I sat there for a long time, the documents spread out in front of me, my mind working through the possibilities. Michael had access. Michael had control. And Michael had a reason. Later that afternoon, Lily came over. She didn't knock, she rarely did. Just walked in like she always had, dropping her backpack by the door and heading straight to the kitchen. You okay? She asked, studying my face more closely than most adults ever did. I gave her a small smile. I'm fine, sweetheart. She didn't believe me. I could tell, but she didn't push not right away. Instead, she sat across from me, resting her chin on her hand. They've been arguing a lot, she said after a moment. Your parents? She nodded. Mostly about money. I felt a quiet confirmation settle inside me. What kind of arguments? I asked gently. Lily hesitated, then lowered her voice. Mom says we're running out of time. And Dad keeps saying he has a plan. A plan! Of course he did. What kind of plan? I asked. She shook her head. I don't know exactly, but I heard him say something about the house again. I stayed very still. What did he say? Lily glanced toward the hallway just like she had before. He said once everything is in place, things will be easier. In place, I repeated softly. She nodded. And just like that, the last piece clicked into position. This wasn't random. This wasn't careless. This was a strategy. Michael wasn't just trying to help me manage things. He was positioning himself, step by step, quietly, patiently, creating a situation where I would seem dependent, confused, incapable. And once that image was established, the house would follow. I felt something rise in my chest then. Not panic, not even anger, something colder. Understanding. I reached across the table and placed my hand over Lily's. "Thank you for telling me," I said quietly. She squeezed my fingers. "You're not going anywhere, right?" The question hit harder than anything else that day. I held her gaze steady and certain. "No," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time, I meant it without doubt. After she left, I went back to Bob's study. The metal box sat exactly where I had left it, but it didn't feel like something hidden anymore. It felt like a foundation. I opened it again this time, not with hesitation, but with purpose. I reviewed the trust documents carefully, read every line, every condition, every protection Bob had built into it. And the more I read, the more I realized just how wrong Michael's assumptions were. This house wasn't something he could simply take. Not legally, not quietly, not without consequences. Which meant one thing. When he said, "You live here because of me," he wasn't speaking from truth. He was speaking from belief. A belief he had convinced himself of. A belief built on the idea that I wouldn't fight back, that I wouldn't question, that I wouldn't understand. But now I understood everything, and more importantly, I was ready. The conversation came 3 days later. Michael didn't call ahead. He rarely did anymore. He and Tiffany simply arrived like they had begun to assume the house operated on their schedule, not mine. I was already in the living room when they walked in, sitting upright, hands folded in my lap, waiting. I had spent those 3 days preparing. Not just reading Bob's file again, but organizing my thoughts, practicing silence, learning how not to react. Because I knew now this wasn't going to be a discussion. It was going to be a move. "Hey, Mom," Michael said, his tone light, almost rehearsed. "We need to talk." Of course we did. Tiffany followed behind him, setting her purse neatly on the side table, like she intended to stay a while. She gave me that same composed smile, polite, controlled, unreadable. "We've been thinking a lot about you," she added, sitting down without waiting to be invited. I nodded slowly. "I imagine you have." Michael didn't seem to catch the edge in my voice. He sat across from me, leaning forward slightly, elbows on his knees, the posture of someone about to explain something important. "We're just concerned," he began, "about how you've been managing things." I said nothing. He continued, "It's a big house, Mom. There's a lot to keep up with. Bills, maintenance, safety. It's a lot for anyone, especially after everything you've been through. After everything you've been through." Grief once again being used as a soft justification. Tiffany chimed in gently. "We just want to make sure you're safe, Elaine. That's all this is about." Safe. That word again. I looked at them both, letting a few seconds of silence stretch between us. "And how exactly are you planning to do that?" I asked. Michael glanced at Tiffany briefly before answering. "We think it might be a good idea for you to consider a senior living community," he said carefully. "Just for a while. Somewhere you can have support. Structure. People around you." There it was. The plan. Laid out calmly like it was the most reasonable suggestion in the world. I tilted my head slightly, and the house Michael didn't hesitate. "I'd take care of it," he said. "Handle everything. Make sure it's maintained. That way you don't have to worry about it." Of course, because that was the point. I folded my hands tighter in my lap, feeling the steady rhythm of my own pulse. "I'm not moving," I said. The words came out quietly, firm, final. Michael blinked clearly, not expecting immediate resistance. "Mom, just hear me out, I heard you," I interrupted gently. "And I said no." A flicker of irritation crossed his face. Tiffany's smile didn't change, but her posture shifted slightly, her body angling forward as if preparing to step in. "It's not about what you want right now," she said, her tone still soft, but edged with something sharper. "It's about what's best for you." I met her eyes. "And who decides that I asked?" Neither of them answered immediately. Michael leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly like he was trying to stay patient. "Mom," he said, his voice tightening, "we've been helping you for a long time now. Managing things, keeping everything running. You can't just pretend you're doing this alone." I almost smiled, because there it was again, the narrative, the one they had been building piece by piece. "You're right," I said calmly. "I haven't been doing it alone." Michael nodded, relieved, thinking I was finally agreeing. "That's exactly what I'm saying, but that doesn't mean I'm incapable." I finished. His expression hardened. "That's not what I said. It's what you're implying." Tiffany crossed her legs, her composure starting to thin. "Elaine, no one is trying to take anything from you. We're trying to help you before something happens, something like what I asked. A fall, a missed payment, a mistake that could cost you everything." I let that hang in the air, because now I understood the strategy completely. Create doubt, highlight vulnerability, establish dependence, and then offer a solution. I leaned forward slightly, my voice still even. "I haven't missed any payments," I said. Michael's jaw tightened. "Well, not that you know of," he replied quickly. "That's the point. I've been handling things, making sure everything stays on track." There it was again. Ownership. Control. I sat back, studying him carefully. "And what happens when I'm gone?" I asked. The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" I mean, I said slowly. "What happens to the house then?" He hesitated. Just for a second. But I saw it, and in that second, everything became clear. "It stays in the family," he said finally. "Meaning you," I replied. He didn't deny it. Instead, he straightened in his seat, his tone shifting from careful to defensive. "I'm your son, Mom. Who else would it go to?" I held his gaze. "That's not the point," I said. "Then what is the point?" he snapped. And that's when it happened. The moment everything tipped. The patience he had been holding onto slipped just enough. His voice sharpened, his expression hardened, and the truth unfiltered came out. "You live here because of me," he said. The words landed in the room like something heavy and irreversible. Tiffany didn't react. Not with shock, not with surprise. Just a quiet stillness, which told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a mistake. This was belief. I felt something inside me go completely still. Not hurt, not anger, just clarity. Because in that moment there was no confusion left. No doubt, no hesitation. Everything I had suspected, everything Bob had prepared for, everything I had begun to understand. It was all right there in one sentence. I stood up slowly. Michael frowned. "Where are you going?" I didn't answer. I turned and walked toward the hallway. Behind me, I could hear Tiffany shift in her seat. "Elaine," she called, her voice tighter now. I kept walking. Step by step. Calm. Controlled. Certain. My hand reached the drawer where I had placed the file. For a brief moment, I paused. Not because I was unsure, but because I understood what this meant. Once I opened that file in front of them, there would be no going back, no pretending, no quiet acceptance. This would change everything. I opened the drawer, took the folder into my hands, and turned back toward the living room. Michael was watching me now, confusion mixed with something else, unease. Tiffany sat very still. I walked back into the room and stopped in front of them. Neither of them spoke. For the first time since they arrived, they were waiting on me. I held the folder lightly in my hands. Then I looked directly at my son. "You should be very careful about what you say next," I told him quietly. And for the first time I saw it. Fear. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam the folder down or accuse or cry. Instead, I walked to the coffee table, set the file gently on its surface, and took a seat across from Michael and Tiffany as if we were about to have a normal conversation. But nothing about that moment was normal. The air in the room had shifted. Michael's posture, which had been confident just minutes earlier, now held a trace of tension. His shoulders were slightly tighter, his eyes flicking between my face and the folder in my hands. Tiffany remained composed, but I noticed the subtle change the way her fingers curled more firmly around the strap of her purse, the way she leaned forward just slightly like she was trying to assess the situation before reacting. I rested my hands on the folder. Calm, steady, deliberate. "You said something just now," I began quietly. "I want to make sure I heard you correctly." Michael frowned. "What are you talking about?" I held his gaze. "You said I live here because of you," I repeated. He shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable being made to repeat it. "That's not exactly what I meant." "No," I said, gently cutting him off. "It's exactly what you said." Silence settled between us. I let it. Because silence has a way of forcing truth to the surface. Michael exhaled sharply, irritation creeping back into his tone. "Fine," he said. "Yeah, I said it. Because it's true in a way, Mom. I've been the one taking care of everything. Without me, you'd be overwhelmed." I nodded slowly as if considering his words. "Then you won't mind if we go over a few things together?" I said. Before he could respond, I opened the folder. The sound of paper shifting filled the room. I pulled out the first document, the original deed, and placed it on the table between us. "This," I said, tapping it lightly, "is the original deed to this house." Michael glanced at it, then back at me, his expression tightening. "I know what a deed is," he said. "I'm sure you do," I replied calmly. "But I want you to look at it carefully." He didn't move, so I slid it closer to him, read the names. Reluctantly, he looked down. I watched his eyes scan the page. "Elaine Barrett," he said. "And Dad." "Robert Barrett," I corrected softly. He nodded, impatient. "Yeah, I know." I let a second pass. "And do you see your name anywhere on that document?" I asked. His jaw clenched. "No," he admitted. "Good," I said. "Then we're starting from the same place." Tiffany shifted beside him. "Elaine, no one is saying," I raised a hand slightly, not in anger, but in control. "Please," I said. "Let's stay focused." She fell silent. I reached for the next document. The house was placed into a trust. I continued laying the papers out neatly. "Years ago. Not recently. Not after your father passed. Long before that." Michael's eyes flicked down again, this time with more attention. What does that have to do with anything he asked? It has everything to do with everything I said. I opened the trust document and turned it toward him. "This trust outlines exactly how this property is managed, protected, and transferred," I explained. "And more importantly, Who has authority over it? He leaned forward slightly, his earlier confidence fading into something more cautious. Well, yeah, he said. That's why I've been helping you manage it. I almost smiled. No, I said quietly. That's what you've been telling yourself. I pointed to a specific section. Read this part. He hesitated. Then slowly he read aloud. The primary resident retains full control of the property unless... He stopped, his voice faltering slightly as he continued reading silently. I watched his face. The shift was subtle at first. A flicker of confusion, then realization, then something deeper. Concern. That's right, I said softly. Unless specific legal conditions are met. Conditions that have not been met. Tiffany leaned in now, trying to follow along. What does that mean? She asked. It means, I replied, still looking at Michael, that no matter what paperwork has been filed, no matter what assumptions have been made, this house is still entirely under my control. Michael sat back slowly, his expression tightening. That's not what I was told, he said. Who told you that, I asked. He didn't answer. I reached for another document. This is a record of financial transactions, I said, placing it on the table. Loans. Assistance. Support that your father provided over the years. Michael's face darkened. That's irrelevant, he snapped. No, I said calmly. It's not. I slid the document closer to him. It shows a pattern, I continued. A pattern of dependence. Of borrowing. Of expecting things to be taken care of. That's not fair, he said, his voice rising slightly. Fair, I repeated. We're not discussing fairness. We're discussing facts. Tiffany's composure finally cracked just a little. Elaine, this is unnecessary. We're family. Yes, I said. Which is why this matters. I opened the final section of the folder. The private notes. Bob's notes. I didn't hand them over immediately. Instead, I held them in my hands for a moment, feeling the weight of them. Then I looked directly at Michael. Your father was a careful man, I said. He didn't leave things to chance, especially not when it came to this house. Michael swallowed, his throat tightening. What are you saying? He asked. I'm saying, I replied slowly, that he anticipated this. The room went completely still. Tiffany frowned. Anticipated what? I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on my son. He documented concerns, I continued, about financial decisions, about patterns of behavior, about the possibility that pressure might be used to gain control. Michael's face went pale. That's not, he started. It's written down, I said, my voice still calm but firm now. Not assumed, not guessed. Documented. I placed the notes on the table. Neither of them reached for them. Neither of them spoke. And for the first time since this all began, they didn't have an answer. I leaned back slightly, letting the silence stretch. Because now the balance had shifted. Not emotionally, not symbolically, legally, practically, undeniably. You said I live here because of you. I said again, my voice softer now but sharper in its meaning. I paused, then added, That's not true. Michael stared at the table, his hands clenched. Tiffany looked between us, her earlier confidence gone, replaced with calculation. And in that moment I knew something had changed, not just in the room, but in them, because they had come here expecting compliance, expectation, control. And instead, they were facing something they hadn't planned for. The truth. I didn't wait for Michael or Tiffany to recover from that moment, because I knew something they didn't yet fully understand. This wasn't just a family disagreement anymore. This was legal, and I needed someone who spoke that language fluently. The next morning, I called an attorney. Her name was Susan Whitaker. She specialized in probate and elder law, and from the moment she answered the phone, I could tell she was the kind of person who listened carefully before speaking. "I'd like to schedule a consultation," I said. "It's regarding my property and some concerns about how it's been handled." She didn't ask unnecessary questions over the phone, just gave me a time and told me to bring whatever documents I had. So I did. The file, every page of it, along with the printed records I had collected from the county office. Walking into Susan Whitaker's office felt very different from walking into the recorder's building. This wasn't just paperwork anymore. This was interpretation, judgment, consequence. Her office was quiet, orderly, filled with books and neatly stacked files. She greeted me with a firm handshake and a calm, attentive expression. "Mrs. Barrett," she said, "please have a seat." I sat across from her and placed the folder on her desk. "I think my son has been handling things he shouldn't have," I said, "and I need to understand exactly what's been done and what it means." She nodded. "Let's take a look," she said. For the next hour, Susan read, carefully, methodically. She didn't rush. She didn't interrupt. She simply reviewed each document with the kind of focus that made me realize just how much I had been guessing up until now. Occasionally, she made notes, marked certain pages, paused to reread specific sections. I sat quietly watching her, feeling a strange mix of anxiety and relief. Because whatever she said next, it would be based on truth, not assumptions, not emotion. Finally, she closed the folder and leaned back slightly. "All right," she said. "Let's walk through this." I nodded, my hands folded tightly in my lap. First, she began, "Your husband was extremely thorough." A small, unexpected warmth moved through me. "That doesn't surprise me," I said softly. She gave a slight smile. "He's set up a trust structure that is very clear and very protective." "Protective how?" I asked. "In multiple ways," she replied. "The property is not directly exposed in a way that allows easy transfer or control by another party. You retain authority unless specific legal conditions are met." I exhaled slowly. "So nothing has been taken from me?" "Not yet," she said carefully. "Not yet." Those two words carried weight, but she continued. "There are some concerning elements." I felt my chest tighten again, such as, she turned the printed county records toward me. "These filings," she said, tapping the page, "suggest that someone has been attempting to position themselves for future control, not through direct transfer, but through groundwork." "Groundwork?" I repeated. "Yes," she said. "Establishing involvement, creating a record of managing affairs, possibly building a narrative of dependency." My stomach dropped. "That's exactly what's been happening," I said. She nodded. "I believe you." The simplicity of that response steadied me more than anything else. "He's been handling my mail," I continued, "managing payments, bringing me documents to sign, telling me they were routine." Susan's expression sharpened slightly. "That's where things become more serious," she said. "Why?" "Because intent matters," she explained. If someone is influencing financial decisions, controlling access to information, or presenting documents without full clarity, that can cross into legal misconduct. The word sat heavily between us. Misconduct. "This is my son," I said quietly. "I understand," she replied gently. "And that makes it more complicated emotionally, but legally the relationship doesn't excuse the behavior." I looked down at my hands. For a moment, the weight of it all pressed in again, not just what Michael had done, but what it meant. Then Susan continued, The good news, she said, is that your husband anticipated risk. And because of that, you are not in a vulnerable position right now. I looked up. So I still have control. Yes, she said firmly. You do. A steady sense of relief moved through me, but it didn't last long because I knew the situation wasn't over. What do I do next? I asked. Susan folded her hands on the desk. We act, she said. There was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty, just clarity. First, we secure your accounts, she continued. Any access your son currently has, we revoke it. I nodded. Second, we document everything she said, every interaction, every document he has handled, every instance where he may have misrepresented information. And third, she held my gaze. We establish legal boundaries. That phrase landed with quiet force. Meaning. She said we make it clear formally that he does not have authority over your property, your finances, or your decisions. I let that settle. Because this wasn't just about correcting a misunderstanding. This was about drawing a line. And if he doesn't accept that I asked. Susan's expression didn't change. Then we escalate. The word was calm, but absolute. What does that look like? I asked. It depends on his response, she said. Some people, when confronted with clear legal reality, step back. Others don't. I thought about Michael, about his confidence, his certainty, the way he had spoken to me just days ago. I don't think he's going to step back easily, I said. Susan gave a small nod. Then it's good you came here before things progressed further, she replied. I sat in silence for a moment, absorbing everything. Then I asked the question that had been sitting quietly in the back of my mind. Did he do anything illegal yet? Susan considered that carefully. From what I see, she said he has approached a line, possibly crossed it in smaller ways, but he hasn't completed anything that would fully expose him yet. Again. So he's still trying, I said. Yes, she replied, which means he believes he has time. I nodded slowly, because now I understood something important. Michael wasn't reacting, he was executing, and he thought he was ahead. Susan closed the folder again and slid it back toward me. You're not powerless in this situation, she said. In fact, you're in a stronger position than he realizes. I placed my hand on the file. For the first time since all of this began, I felt it. Not fear, not doubt, but something solid, grounded, control. Then let's make sure he understands that, I said. Susan gave a small approving nod. We will, she replied. And as I walked out of her office that afternoon, I knew one thing for certain. Michael wasn't the only one with a plan anymore. The first thing Susan had warned me about was that Michael wouldn't react in just one way. He'll try what works, she had said, and if one approach fails, he'll switch to another. She was right. The apology came first. It was 2 days after my meeting with her. I was in the kitchen again. Funny how so much of this seemed to happen there when Michael walked in alone this time. No Tiffany. No careful coordination. Just him. Mom, he said, his voice softer than I had heard it in weeks. I didn't look up immediately. I finished stirring my tea, set the spoon down, and then turned toward him. Yes. He stepped closer, his hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly slouched. It was a posture I recognized from years ago, the version of him that appeared when he wanted forgiveness without fully asking for it. I think things got out of hand the other day, he said. I said nothing. I shouldn't have said what I said, he continued. About the house. A pause. I was stressed. There it was. The explanation that wasn't quite an apology. I folded my hands calmly on the counter, stressed about what I asked. He hesitated, then sighed. Everything. Work. Bills. Life. You know how it is. I held his gaze. Yes, I said. I do. Because I did, but that didn't make what he had done acceptable. I was just trying to help, he added quickly. I didn't mean to make it sound like you didn't belong here. I almost smiled, because now I could hear it clearly. He wasn't apologizing for the belief. He was apologizing for saying it out loud. I see, I said. He waited, expecting something. Relief. Reassurance. Maybe even forgiveness. But I didn't give him any of those things. Instead, I asked, what exactly have you been handling for me? Michael. The question caught him off guard. What do you mean, I mean? I said evenly. My accounts. My mail. My paperwork. What have you been doing specifically? He shifted slightly. Just organizing things, he said, making sure bills get paid, keeping everything in order, and the documents you've had me sign. They were routine, he said quickly. Nothing major. I nodded slowly. Then you won't mind if I have everything reviewed, I said. That's when his expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. A flicker of tension. Reviewed, he repeated. Yes, I said. By an attorney. Silence. For just a moment. Then he forced a small laugh. Mom, you don't need to do that. It's overkill. I've been taking care of everything just fine. I'm sure you believe that, I replied. The softness of my tone seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. Believe it, he said, his voice tightening slightly. It's not about belief. It's about trust. I tilted my head. Yes, I said. It is. Another silence. He was trying to read me now, trying to figure out how much I knew, how far I had gone. And for the first time, he wasn't certain. I just don't understand why you'd go behind my back like that, he said. I let that sit for a second. Then I said very calmly, I didn't go behind your back, Michael. I went around your control. The words landed harder than I expected. He straightened slightly, his posture losing that softened edge. There is no control, he said sharply. I've been helping you. Without transparency, I replied, That's not fair. Fair, I said quietly. You've been handling my mail. That's because you've been adjusting my accounts. That's not. You've been presenting documents for me to sign without full explanation. That's standard no, I said, cutting him off. This time there was no softness left. That's not standard, I said firmly. That's control. The room went still. For a moment I saw it again, that shift. The same one from before. The one where patience slipped and something else came forward. Frustration. Why are you making this into something it's not? He demanded. Because it is something I said. He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. This is exactly what I was worried about, he muttered. What does that mean? He looked at me, then really looked at me, and for a brief second I saw something new. Not just frustration, not just defensiveness. Fear. You're letting people get into your head, he said, making you paranoid, turning you against your own family. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. The shift, from apology to accusation. I don't need anyone to do that, I said quietly. I can think for myself. He opened his mouth and closed it again, because there was no easy response to that. Before he could say anything else, the front door opened. Tiffany. She walked in quickly, her eyes moving between us, immediately sensing the tension. "What's going on?" she asked. Michael exhaled sharply. "She's talking to a lawyer." Tiffany's expression changed instantly. Not panic, but calculation. "A lawyer." She repeated, her tone carefully neutral. "Why would you do that, Elaine?" I turned toward her. "Because I want clarity," I said. Clarity about what she asked. About my finances, my property, my legal standing. Her lips pressed together slightly. "That seems unnecessary," she said. "We've been handling everything responsibly." I held her gaze. "That's exactly what I'm verifying," I replied. Another silence. But this one felt different. Heavier. Because now they both understood. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a conversation that could be smoothed over. This was a line, and I had drawn it. Tiffany stepped closer, her voice lowering just slightly. "Elaine," she said, "we're family. We don't need to bring outsiders into this." I almost admired how calmly she said it, how reasonable it sounded. But I knew better now. "Family doesn't remove the need for accountability," I said. Michael let out a frustrated breath. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You're blowing everything out of proportion." I didn't respond, because there was nothing left to argue. Everything that needed to be said had already been said, and more importantly, everything that needed to be done was already in motion. They just didn't know how far it had gone yet. And that was fine, because for the first time since all of this began, I wasn't reacting to them. I was ahead of them. The birthday gathering was supposed to be simple. That's what Karen had said when she called me earlier that week. Just a small family dinner for our cousin Margaret. Nothing formal, nothing dramatic. A few relatives, some cake, a chance to sit together and talk about things that didn't involve tension or paperwork or difficult conversations. For a moment, I almost believed that might be possible. But families don't exist in neat compartments. What happens behind closed doors has a way of following you quietly, patiently, until it finds the right moment to surface. And that moment came sooner than I expected. Karen's house was warm and familiar, filled with the soft hum of conversation when I arrived. The smell of roasted chicken and fresh bread lingered in the air. People were already gathered in the living room laughing, catching up, moving easily between conversations. For a brief second, I felt something close to normal again. Then I saw Michael. He was standing near the dining table talking to two of my cousins. His posture relaxed, his expression open, confident. Tiffany stood beside him, smiling politely, nodding at the right moments. To anyone watching, they looked like the perfect couple. Responsible, attentive, concerned. I felt a quiet shift inside me, because now I could see it clearly. The performance. Michael noticed me then and gave a small wave. "Mom," he called out, his voice warm, inviting. "Glad you made it." I walked toward him slowly, offering a polite smile. "Of course," I said. For a few minutes, everything stayed surface level. Small talk, updates, careful politeness. But tension doesn't disappear. It waits. And then, inevitably, someone says something that pulls it back into the room. In this case, it was my cousin Linda. She glanced between Michael and me and said casually, "You're lucky to have a son so involved, Elaine. Not everyone gets that kind of support." The words were meant kindly. That's what made them dangerous. I felt Michael's attention shift immediately. This was his moment, his narrative. "Yeah," he said with a modest shrug. I've been helping her manage things. You know how it is after losing Dad. It's a lot." Heads nodded around the room. Understanding. Sympathy. Agreement, Tiffany added softly. "We just want to make sure she's taken care of." Taken care of. I stood there listening, watching, because now I knew what was happening. He wasn't just speaking. He was shaping perception, building a version of reality where he was the responsible son, and I was the dependent mother. And if I stayed quiet, that version would become truth. I set my glass down carefully, and for the first time that evening I spoke. "I appreciate the concern," I said calmly, "but I'd like to clarify something." The room quieted slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough. Michael turned toward me, a faint crease forming between his brows. "Clarify what?" he asked. I met his gaze. Who's actually managing what? A subtle tension moved through the space. Michael gave a small laugh, trying to lighten it. "Mom? We don't need to get into details here." "I think we do," I said gently. That stopped him, because my tone wasn't confrontational. It was steady, measured, intentional. I turned slightly toward the others in the room. "Over the past year," I continued, "Michael has been assisting me with certain tasks. Bills, mail, paperwork. More nodding. Familiar, expected. But recently," I added, "I began reviewing those arrangements more closely." Michael's posture stiffened. Tiffany's smile faded just slightly, and I discovered that some decisions were being made without my full understanding, I said. A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Michael stepped in quickly. "That's not what happened," he said. "I was just helping streamline things by limiting access to information." I asked calmly. His voice sharpened. "That's not fair. I didn't raise mine." "I have documentation," I said. The words landed softly, but heavily. Silence followed, not complete but enough that conversations nearby began to slow, attention shifting toward us. Tiffany spoke next, her tone controlled. "Elaine, this really isn't the place for—" "It's exactly the place," I said, still calm, "because this is where assumptions are being made." I turned back to the group. "I want to be very clear," I said. "I am fully capable of managing my own affairs, and I have taken steps to ensure that remains the case." Michael's jaw tightened. What steps he demanded? I looked at him. Legal ones. That did it. The word changed everything, because now this wasn't just a disagreement. It was real. Concrete. Unavoidable. Tiffany's composure cracked for the first time. "You went to a lawyer?" she asked. "Yes," I said. Michael let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "So now we're doing this," he said. "Turning family matters into legal problems." "No," I replied. "I'm addressing legal matters that were brought into the family." The room was completely still now. No one was pretending not to listen anymore. Michael shook his head, his frustration spilling over. "This is unbelievable," he said. "After everything I've done for you." "What have you done for me?" I asked quietly. The question cut through his momentum. He blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said, holding his gaze, "what have you done for me that didn't also benefit you?" That landed harder than anything else I had said, because there was no easy answer, and for the first time he didn't have one. Instead, he shifted tactics. His voice lowered, more personal now, more pointed. "You always do this," he said. "Do what act like everything is a transaction," he replied. "Like nothing I do is ever enough." The words hit something deeper, because they weren't entirely new. They echoed something from years ago, a quiet accusation I had heard before but never fully addressed. "I'm not saying that I said." "You don't have to," he snapped. "You've always made it clear." There it was, the pivot. From defense to emotional attack. "You were never around Mom," he continued. "You were always working, always busy, always choosing everything else over me." The room shifted again, not with tension this time, with something heavier, discomfort, because now this wasn't about property. This was about history. And for a brief moment I felt it, that familiar pull, guilt, regret. The part of me that wondered if maybe, just maybe, I had missed something important along the way, but then I remembered something Susan had said. Don't let emotional history override present facts. I took a slow breath and steadied myself. "We're not talking about the past," I said quietly. "We should be," he shot back. "Because this," he gestured between us, "this is exactly why I had to step in. Because you don't trust anyone." I looked at him carefully. "No," I said. "I don't trust manipulation." Silence. Final. Complete. Because that was the truth, and there was nothing left to argue around it. Michael stood there for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he looked away. Tiffany touched his arm lightly. "Let's go," she said under her breath. He didn't argue. They left shortly after. No goodbyes, no resolution, just absence. The room slowly returned to normal. Conversations resumed, but something had changed. Not just for me, for everyone. Because now the truth wasn't hidden anymore. And once something like that comes into the open, it doesn't go back. I didn't sleep much the night after the gathering. Not because of fear. Not even because of what Michael had said in front of everyone. But because for the first time in a very long time, I allowed myself to look back honestly without softening the edges or making excuses. And what I saw wasn't comfortable. I made coffee before sunrise and sat at the kitchen table, the house quiet around me. The same table where Michael used to do his homework. The same place where Bob and I once planned budgets, vacations, and a future that felt steady. I wrapped my hands around the mug and let the memories come. Michael as a child wasn't difficult. That's what made it harder to accept everything now. He was bright, curious, sensitive in ways he didn't always show. But he also had a tendency, small at first, almost unnoticeable, to avoid responsibility. If something went wrong, there was always a reason. A teacher who didn't explain things clearly, a friend who distracted him, circumstances that just didn't line up. And I often let those explanations stand. Not because I believed them completely, but because it was easier. Easier than pushing. Easier than confronting. Easier than being the parent who demanded more when I was already stretched thin. Bob saw it differently. I remember one night Michael must have been about 16. He had missed a deadline for something important at school, and instead of taking responsibility, he blamed the system. Said the teacher hadn't been clear that the expectations were unfair. Bob didn't argue. He just listened. And then he said something I didn't fully understand at the time. "Excuses feel like protection," he told Michael. "But they're actually a trap. The more you rely on them, the less control you have over your own life." Michael didn't respond well to that. He shut down. And I stepped in. "Bob," I had said gently, "he's under a lot of pressure. Maybe just give him some space." Bob didn't argue with me either, but later that night when we were alone, he looked at me in a way that stayed with me long after. "You're protecting him from discomfort," he said, "not helping him grow." I remember brushing it off, telling myself that balance mattered, that not every lesson needed to be hard, that Michael would figure things out in his own time. And for a while it seemed like he did. He went to college, got a job, built a life. There were setbacks, of course, but I saw them as normal, temporary, something he would outgrow. What I didn't fully see, or maybe didn't want to see, was the pattern. The way he leaned on others when things became difficult, the way responsibility shifted, quietly, almost invisibly, from him to someone else. First it was small, then it became consistent, and Bob noticed every step of it. He kept records, not just financial ones, observational ones, things I thought were unnecessary at the time. But now I understood. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the bitterness settle, because the truth wasn't just about Michael, it was about me too. I had chosen peace over confrontation, chosen understanding over accountability, chosen to believe that love would naturally lead to growth. But love without boundaries doesn't guide, it enables. And that realization hurt more than anything Michael had said, because it meant this wasn't just something that had been done to me. It was something that had been allowed. I closed my eyes for a moment, taking that in, not to punish myself, but to accept it. Because without acceptance, there is no clarity, and without clarity, there is no change. Later that morning, Lily came by again. She didn't say anything at first, just walked into the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water, and sat across from me like she always did. "You okay?" she asked after a moment. I nodded. "Yes," I said. "I think I finally am." She studied my face carefully. "You don't look upset," she said. "I'm not," I replied. That surprised her. Even after yesterday, I smiled slightly. Yesterday wasn't the worst part, I said. What was the part where I had to admit what I missed? She frowned slightly. "I don't get it." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. "When someone you love makes mistakes, I said it's easy to focus on the mistake itself. But sometimes, the harder truth is realizing how long it's been happening." Lily was quiet for a moment. "Is that about Dad?" she asked softly. "Yes," I said. She looked down at her hands. "He's been different lately," she said, "like stressed, but also kind of angry." I nodded. "I know." "Are you going to forgive him?" she asked. The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. She looked back up at me. "Why not?" "Because forgiveness isn't just about what someone says," I explained. "It's about what they understand. And he doesn't understand. Not yet." She thought about that, then nodded slowly. "I think he's scared," she said. That caught my attention. "Why do you think that?" She shrugged. "Because when people get called out, they either get honest or they get louder." I couldn't help but smile at that. "That's a very wise observation," I said. She smiled a little too. "I learn from watching," she said, and I believed her, because Lily had been watching all along, seeing things I hadn't allowed myself to fully see. And now she was part of something else too, not just the problem, but the clarity that followed it. "I want you to know something," I said, reaching across the table. She looked at me. "No matter what happens between me and your father," I said, "you're not in the middle of it." She nodded. "I know. And you don't have to choose sides." She hesitated, then said quietly, "I already did." My heart tightened slightly. "Lily, I didn't choose against him," she said quickly. "I just chose what's right." I held her gaze, and in that moment I saw something that gave me more strength than anything else had so far. Clarity, not just in me, but in her. And that meant something, because change, real change, doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from recognition, from seeing things as they are, and deciding quietly but firmly not to repeat them. I squeezed her hand gently. "Then you're already ahead of where most people get," I said. She smiled faintly, and for the first time in days, the house didn't feel heavy, it felt honest. The legal meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Susan had been very clear about what needed to happen and how it needed to happen. "This is not about emotion," she told me the day before. "It's about structure, clarity, and consequences." So I prepared myself accordingly. No rehearsed speeches, no arguments, just facts. Michael arrived 10 minutes late. Tiffany came with him. That didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was how different they looked compared to just a few days ago. The confidence was gone. Not entirely, but enough. Michael's posture was more rigid, his movements less controlled. Tiffany still carried herself with composure, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes sharper now, more alert. They knew this wasn't something they could smooth over. Susan greeted them professionally. "Michael, Tiffany, thank you for coming." No warmth, no hostility, just neutrality. We all took our seats around the conference table. The room was quiet, orderly, exactly the kind of place where reality doesn't bend to emotion. Susan opened the folder in front of her. "I'll keep this direct," she said. "Mrs. Barrett has asked me to review her financial and property situation, particularly in relation to recent actions involving her residence." Michael leaned back slightly, crossing his arms. "I've been helping my mother," he said. "That's all this is." Susan didn't react. "That may be your perspective," she replied calmly, "but we're here to establish facts." She turned a document toward him. "This is the trust governing the property," she said. "Have you reviewed it in full?" Michael hesitated. "Not every detail," he admitted. "I recommend that you do," she said. There was no judgment in her tone, but there didn't need to be. He picked up the document and glanced over it again more carefully this time. Tiffany leaned in slightly, reading along. Susan continued. "This trust clearly states that Mrs. Barrett retains full control of the property unless specific legal conditions are met. Those conditions have not been met." Michael's jaw tightened. "That doesn't mean I was doing anything wrong," he said. Susan nodded slightly. "Intent and outcome are two different things," she said. "Let's look at the actions." She laid out the county filings next. "These documents indicate that steps were being taken to establish a framework for future control of the property," she explained. Michael shook his head. "That's not accurate," he said. "I was just trying to make things easier for her down the line." Susan met his gaze. By submitting paperwork she did not fully understand silence. He didn't answer, because he couldn't. Tiffany stepped in. There was no deception, she said. Everything was done with good intentions. Susan nodded again. "I'm not questioning your intentions," she said. "I'm addressing the method." That distinction hung in the air, sharp, clear, unavoidable. She turned to me briefly. "Mrs. Barrett, you've confirmed that you were not fully informed of the implications of these documents at the time you signed them. Is that correct?" "Yes," I said. Michael exhaled sharply. I explained everything he said. "She just doesn't remember," I remember exactly what I was told, I said calmly. And what I wasn't told, that stopped him, because this time I didn't sound uncertain. I sounded certain. Susan continued. In addition, she said we have documentation of financial activity that was managed without full transparency. She slid another set of papers forward. Adjustments to accounts. Mail handling. Payment redirection. Michael's expression darkened. That was for her benefit, he said. To make things simpler, Susan didn't raise her voice. Control without transparency is not simplification, she said. It's restriction. That word landed hard. Tiffany shifted in her seat. This is being blown out of proportion, she said. We're talking about family helping family. Susan folded her hands on the table. And I respect that, she said. But when financial authority and property rights are involved, the law does not make exceptions for family relationships. Silence. Heavy. Final. Michael leaned forward now, his earlier restraint starting to slip. So what are you saying? He asked. That I broke the law? Susan paused. Measured. Precise. I'm saying... She replied that your actions approached legal boundaries in a way that could become problematic if continued. Michael stared at her. And if I don't agree with that? Then we proceed formally, she said. No hesitation. No threat. Just fact. Tiffany's composure cracked again. What does that mean? She asked. It means Susan said that Mrs. Barrett will take steps to legally protect her assets, revoke any informal authority, and establish clear restrictions on further involvement. Michael's hands tightened on the table. So you're cutting me out, he said, looking at me. I met his gaze. I'm restoring boundaries, I said. That's the same thing he snapped. No, I replied. It's not. Another silence. But this one felt different, because now there was nothing left to argue. The structure had been laid out, the facts had been presented, and the outcome was no longer negotiable. Susan spoke again. There is also the matter of financial discrepancies, she said. While not all of them rise to the level of legal violation, they do establish a pattern of overreach. Michael looked away. Tiffany spoke more quietly now. What happens next? She asked. Susan's answer was immediate. Mrs. Barrett has the option to pursue further legal action, she said. However, she paused just briefly. She has chosen not to. That shifted the room. Michael looked back at me, surprised. What he said. I held his gaze. I'm not here to destroy you, I said. The words were calm, but they carried weight. I'm here to stop this, I continued. Completely. He swallowed. And what does that mean? It means I said you step back. Completely. From my finances, from my property, from any decisions that belong to me. And if I don't, I didn't answer immediately. I didn't need to. Susan did. Then the situation changes, she said. That was enough. Michael leaned back slowly, the fight leaving him not all at once, but piece by piece. Tiffany looked at him, then at me. And for the first time, she didn't try to redirect, didn't try to control the conversation, because she understood something now. There was nothing left to manage. The plan, whatever it had been, was over. Fine, Michael said finally. The word was quiet. Defeated. But real. I'll step back. I nodded. Good. Susan gathered the documents neatly. We'll formalize the agreements, she said. That way there's no ambiguity moving forward. No one argued. Because there was nothing left to argue. As the meeting ended, Michael stood slowly. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something, to explain, to justify, to reclaim something that had already slipped away. But he didn't. He just nodded once and walked out. Tiffany followed. The door closed behind them, and for the first time since all of this began, there was silence. Not tense, not uncertain, just quiet. I exhaled slowly, my hands resting on the table. Susan looked at me. "You handled that well," she said. I nodded, but I didn't feel victorious. I felt clear, because this wasn't about winning. It was about ending something that should have never begun. And now, it was over. The house felt different after that meeting. Not in a dramatic way. There was no sudden transformation, no moment where everything magically became lighter, but something had shifted. The tension that had been quietly sitting in every room, in every conversation, in every glance, it was gone. In its place was something quieter. Space. For the first time in months, I woke up without wondering what had been done without my knowledge. I walked into the kitchen and made my coffee without checking whether the mail had already been sorted. I sat in my own living room and felt like I was sitting in my home again, not occupying it, not maintaining it, but owning it in the way that matters. That doesn't mean it was easy. Peace after conflict often comes with a kind of silence that can feel heavier than the noise that came before it. Michael didn't come by anymore. Not unannounced. Not casually. Not at all. The absence was noticeable. At first, I thought it might feel like relief, and part of it did, but another part of me felt something deeper. Not loss exactly, but a recognition. Because when conflict strips everything down to truth, what remains isn't always comfort. It's clarity, and clarity can be lonely. A week passed, then 2. I focused on what I could control. Susan helped finalize the legal protections revoking access, securing accounts, documenting everything that had happened. It wasn't dramatic work, but it was important. Each step reinforced something I had slowly come to understand. Control isn't about dominance. It's about ownership, responsibility, awareness. I spent more time in Bob's study too, not just going through documents, but restoring it, cleaning the desk, organizing the shelves, reclaiming the space not as something frozen in memory, but as something active again. I planted new flowers in the yard, ones Bob used to like, simple things, nothing extravagant, but they gave me something to tend to, something that responded to care instead of manipulation. Lily came by often, more often than before. She would sit at the kitchen table with her schoolwork, sometimes talking, sometimes just being there. And in that quiet presence, something began to rebuild. Not just between us, but inside me. "You seem different," she said one afternoon, looking up from her notebook. I smiled slightly. "Different, how calmer," she said. "Like, you're not waiting for something to happen anymore." I thought about that and realized she was right. "I'm not," I said. She nodded like that made perfect sense. Because to her, it probably did. Children, especially ones who pay attention, don't need complicated explanations. They recognize truth when they see it. "Have you heard from him?" she asked quietly. I knew who she meant. "No," I said. She hesitated, then added, "Mom and Dad aren't doing great. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. Some outcomes don't require explanation. They argue a lot," she continued. "Mostly about money." I nodded slowly. Because without the house, Without the expectation of what it could provide, the pressure hadn't disappeared. It had just shifted, and now they had to face it, without a solution that wasn't theirs to take. A few days later, Karen called me. I hate to say it, she began, but people are talking. I wasn't surprised. They always do, I said. She sighed. Most of them are on your side. They just didn't know what was going on before. I leaned back in my chair, considering that. That's how it usually works, I said. Are you okay with that? She asked. I thought about it for a moment. Then I said, I'm not concerned with what people think anymore. I'm concerned with what's true. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Karen said softly, You sound like Bob. I smiled. I think I finally understand him, I said. Another week passed, and then, one afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Not a casual knock, not the kind that assumed entry, a deliberate one. I stood still for a moment listening, then I walked to the door and opened it. Michael stood there, alone. No Tiffany, no confidence, no assumptions, just him. For a second, neither of us spoke, because everything that had needed to be said had already been said. He looked tired, not physically, though there was that too, but something deeper, worn down, stripped of certainty. Hi, he said quietly. I nodded. Hi. Another pause. I wasn't sure if you'd open the door, he admitted. I wasn't sure if you'd knock, I replied. That seemed to land. He gave a small, almost self-aware nod. Fair, he said. We stood there for a moment longer. Then he said, Can I come in? I considered it. Not out of fear, not out of obligation, but because I understood what that question meant now. It wasn't just about entering the house. It was about entering something that had been closed. And this time, I wasn't going to open that door automatically. Why, I asked. The question surprised him. I just want to talk, he said. About what? He hesitated, then said, Everything. I studied his face, looking for something. Not perfection, not apology, just honesty, and for the first time in a long time I saw it. Not clearly, not completely, but enough. Still, that didn't mean everything was resolved, because understanding something and changing it are not the same thing. I'm not ready for that yet, I said. His expression fell slightly, but he didn't argue, didn't push. Okay, he said quietly. That more than anything else told me something had shifted, because before, he would have insisted, he would have justified, he would have found a way to make it about urgency. Now, he stepped back. I just wanted to say, he began, then stopped. He looked down briefly, then back at me. I get it now, he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight, because they weren't defensive. They weren't calculated. They were admitted. I nodded slowly. That's a start, I said. He gave a small nod in return, then stepped back from the door. I'll give you time, he said. I didn't respond, because time wasn't something he could offer. It was something he had to earn. He turned and walked away. No argument, no expectation, just distance. I closed the door gently and stood there for a moment, not feeling relief, not feeling closure, but something quieter, something steadier. The kind of understanding that doesn't come from words, but from what happens after them. Michael didn't come back the next day, or the day after that. And for the first time in my life, I didn't interpret that silence as distance. I understood it as space. Not avoidance, not punishment, just space. Weeks passed. The house settled into a new rhythm, one that belonged entirely to me again. I made decisions without consulting anyone. I reviewed my own mail. I handled my accounts. And each time I did something that had once been quietly taken from me, I felt something restore itself. Not just control, confidence, ownership of my life, of my choices, of myself. Lily continued to visit, though less frequently now that school had become more demanding. But when she did, she stayed longer. We talked more. Not just about what had happened, but about everything: her plans, her thoughts, her questions about the future. One afternoon, she asked me something that stayed with me. "Do you think people really change?" she said, looking up from her phone. I thought about it for a moment. Then I said, "I think people can change, but only when they stop protecting who they were." She frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means," I explained, "as long as someone is focused on defending their past behavior, they can't move forward. Change starts when they're willing to admit they were wrong without excuses." She nodded slowly. "Do you think Dad is there yet?" I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, I didn't know. But I had learned something important. It wasn't my responsibility to determine that for him. "It's his decision," I said finally. "And yours?" she asked. "My decision," I replied, "is whether I allow him back into my life based on what he does next." She seemed to understand that, and in that understanding I saw something I hadn't always recognized before. Strength. Not loud, not dramatic, but clear. And that mattered. A few days later, Michael came back. This time he didn't knock immediately. He stood on the porch for a moment, just long enough that I saw him through the window before he raised his hand. And when he knocked, it was the same as before. Deliberate, respectful. I opened the door. He looked different again. Not just tired this time, quieter. Like someone who had spent time sitting with things he couldn't avoid. "Hi," he said. "Hi." We stood there for a moment, the space between us no longer tense, but not yet easy either. I meant what I said before he began. About getting it. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't hear him, but because I needed more than words. He seemed to understand that. "I've been thinking a lot," he continued. "About everything. About what I did. About how I got there." I waited. For a long time, he said slowly, "I told myself I was helping you, that I was stepping up, being responsible." He gave a small, almost bitter smile. "But the truth is, I wasn't stepping up." He looked at me directly. I was trying to take something I hadn't earned. The honesty of it landed deeper than anything he had said before. Not because it fixed anything, but because it named it. Clearly, without distortion. I convinced myself it was okay. He went on, "Because I'm your son, because I was around, because I needed it." He paused, then added quietly, "Because I thought I deserved it." I held his gaze. "And now," I asked. He exhaled slowly. "Now I realize I was wrong. Simple. Direct. No justification. No shifting. Just wrong." We stood in silence for a moment. Then he said, "I don't expect you to forgive me." That caught my attention. "Why not?" "Because I wouldn't," he said. The answer was immediate, unfiltered, and strangely honest. "I crossed a line." he continued. Not just legally, personally. I treated you like you were something to manage, not someone to respect. I felt something shift inside me, not softening, but recognizing, because that was the truth I had been waiting to hear. Not that he was sorry, but that he understood. I don't know how to fix it, he admitted. But I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen. That mattered, more than apology, more than explanation. Because acknowledgement is where change begins. I appreciate that, I said. He nodded as if that alone was more than he expected. I also want you to know, he added, I'm not going to touch anything anymore. Your finances. The house. None of it. That's not mine. I watched him carefully. And what is yours? I asked. He hesitated, then said, whatever I build myself. There it was, the shift. From entitlement to responsibility, and in that moment I understood something clearly. This wasn't resolution. Not yet, but it was direction. You're right about one thing, I said. He looked at me. The house isn't the inheritance. He nodded slowly. I know. What your father left behind, I continued, wasn't just property. It was standards, expectations, a way of living. Michael's expression softened slightly. I didn't want those, he said quietly. I wanted the easy version. I gave a small knowing nod. Most people do. We stood there for a moment longer. Then I said, I'm not going to pretend everything is okay. I know, he said. I'm also not going to close the door completely, I added. That surprised him. He looked up, searching my face. What does that mean? He asked. It means, I said, if you want to rebuild something, anything, it won't be based on what you say. He nodded. Understood. It will be based on what you do. I finished. He took that in, not defensively, not reluctantly, but with acceptance. I can do that, he said. I didn't respond right away, because belief isn't something you give freely, it's something you allow over time. But I did step back slightly from the doorway, not fully, just enough. And that was intentional, because this time, access wasn't assumed, it was earned. Michael noticed. He didn't rush forward, didn't take advantage. He just stood there, respecting the space. And in that moment, I realized something. The house hadn't just been a place of conflict. It had been a test of boundaries, of truth, of what remains when everything else is stripped away. And what remained was this, not perfect, not easy, but honest. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough. There comes a point in life when you realize that love and trust are not the same thing. Love can exist even when trust has been broken. It can remain through disappointment, through distance, even through betrayal. But trust requires something more. It requires honesty, responsibility, and most importantly, respect. What I learned through all of this is that growing older does not mean giving up your voice. It does not mean becoming smaller, quieter, or easier to control. In fact, it means the opposite. It means knowing who you are clearly, firmly, and refusing to let anyone redefine that for you. Sometimes the hardest part isn't standing up to strangers. It's standing up to the people you love. But boundaries are not cruelty. They are clarity. And clarity is what protects everything else. If you've ever felt taken for granted by someone close to you, I want you to know you're not alone. And more importantly, you're not powerless. So tell me, what would you have done in my place? I'd truly love to hear your thoughts and where you're watching from today. If this story meant something to you, Don't forget to like and subscribe so we can keep sharing stories that matter.